Thank you. So thanks to everyone for being here, and special thanks to the BPRG board for supporting all of us, making this happen. Thanks to Sherry, who is the wizard behind all of this. And also thanks to my wonderful husband, Shippen Page, who, if you haven't met him, I hope you will. He supports me in all ways, intellectual, emotional, physically, and spiritually. So thank you. So today we're lucky enough to have Peter Hendricks calling in from Birmingham, an advantage of Zoom, though we wish we could have you in person, University of Alabama in Birmingham. Peter is a PhD and a professor, director of research in the Department of Health Behavior of the School of Public Health at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. His research centers on the development of novel and potentially more effective treatments for substance dependence, with specific areas of focus on cigarette, cocaine, cannabis, opiate, and polysubstance dependence in vulnerable populations, such as individuals in the criminal justice system. Since 2014, Dr. Hendricks has published approximately 20 peer-reviewed manuscripts relating to psychedelics, including population studies suggesting that psychedelics may be effective in preventing and treating substance abuse, criminal recidivism, psychological distress, and suicidality. Recently, he proposed that the emotion awe represents the psychological mechanism underlying the effects of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. He's currently a principal investigator of an ongoing pilot trial of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for cocaine dependence, and also is one of the leaders of 3 centers. So his center, Hopkins and NYU, has just gotten a $4 million from NIDA, one of the first in 50 years to get from the federal government. So we'd love to hear about that. I also want to do a shout out to Dan Grossman, who's been a very loyal member of the BPRG, who now has moved down to Birmingham to work with Peter. So thank you, Dan, for helping connect us with Peter. So the title today of the talk is Classic Psychedelics Work, but how? So we'll look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I will just go ahead and jump right in. I guess I will share my screen. Let's hope this works. Let me know if there are any issues here.
It works.
Can everybody see? I'm about to start the slideshow.
It works.
Do I hear someone saying something?
Yeah, I was just letting you know it works, Peter.
Okay,
great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. So yeah, there's the title. I should say I took some liberties. When we say classic psychedelic works, I guess from the perspective of FDA, we haven't shown that definitively. Though I will always like to say that humans, it appears, have used these substances for a long time. A number of different cultures, it would appear, have sort of grasped that they are therapeutic in some way. So I think it's best to say that maybe a number of elder traditions would agree that they work, that they're helpful for a number of different mental health conditions, or whatever term we might use, but we are just now subjecting them to the Western scientific process and whatever FDA requires so that they could be available in these formal treatment settings. So the question here is, let's just assume we've reached this point. We all agree that they seem to do something, but the question is, from my perspective, why? So let's move forward with this. So I'm glad I'm here with a group where I don't really have to explain what psychedelics are. I can probably go through these slides pretty quickly. But as I said, they've been used for a long time. They're widespread in nature, and the existing evidence suggests that they're used for a number of purposes, but always in a sort of therapeutic and highly ritualized sacramental setting. And again, many of you probably know that they occasion mystical experiences. I know that my friends and colleagues at Hopkins, including Roland Griffiths, has recently said that he has some regret around the term because it suggests that we're appealing to something that can't be measured, that's outside of science. But that's not at all the case. And if any of you are familiar with the work of Ralph Hood, you'll know that he's been studying these experiences. He's been quantifying them and studying them as a very rigorous scientist for years. And his mysticism scale, I think, was developed in the early 70s. So it's been a topic of interest among scientists well before psychedelics were on the scene. And of course, after they went underground for a period of time. So we know that these sort of things happen. They can happen organically, probably not very commonly. And I think what's so neat about psychedelics then is that we can essentially schedule a mystical experience. It would appear for a certain date and time and for a particular purpose. And that's really neat. Maybe a better term might be transcendent experience or peak experience. Choose your label. But we know that at the heart of this is a sense of unity or oneness, a transcendence of time and space, a very deeply felt positive mood, a sense of sacredness, introspection, insight, ineffability, and we shouldn't look past that. For some people, there could be some fear, panic, or anxiety, especially early on. Okay, so my 8-year-old has to ask a question right now. I spent the past hour preparing for this and telling them I'd be talking, but again, I guess we just have to do this. James, can you ask your question so we can move on?
Do you know where a charger for this is?
No, please go ask your sister. All right, sorry about that. These are the joys of presenting from home on a weekend. So many of you have probably seen Michael Bogenschutz's work with alcohol dependence. And now this was a single-arm open-label trial, of course. There's no placebo control, so there's not a great deal we can take from it. But I think the reduction in drinking that we see after only one administration of psilocybin is quite striking. And we can see that it's maintained through 9 months after end of treatment. And if anything, this suggests we need to study this more. And of course, Michael has, and I think we'll be seeing his findings pretty soon. And this will be in a larger trial with a placebo control. You've probably also seen this work that Matt Johnson has presented. And of course, Mary Casamano here has been intimately involved in this work too. In this study and some additional data he's collected with placebo controls, we see really quite striking findings with smoking cessation. And I can tell you, having worked in smoking cessation for 20-something years, we could give 100 people the very, very best treatment that money can buy, including intensive counseling and pharmacotherapy, sometimes multiple forms of nicotine replacement therapy. And if 30 of those smokers actually quit smoking, we'd be doing a pretty good job, relatively speaking. Obviously, we need to do a lot better. If we give 100 people the very best treatment money can buy and 70 are still smoking, then I feel like we're not doing a very good job. So I'm really excited, as Anne mentioned, about this study that we'll be doing at NYU, at Hopkins, and UAB to see if psilocybin could be added to the sort of arsenal of treatments that are available for smokers, especially when you consider that 500,000 people die every year from smoking. That's really astounding if you think about it now. 500,000 people, that's more than all the soldiers we lost in World War II in the European and Asian theaters every year. And it's by far our #1 public health problem. So to think that psilocybin could potentially put a dent in this massive public health problem is really exciting. I think ultimately we're going to save lives, or at least that's the hope. And okay, please, last one.
Do you know where the charger is with like 3 cords on it?
I don't. Please ask your sister, okay?
I did.
Okay.
She said that would work.
Okay, well, you'll have to go look for that, okay?
Okay.
Goodness me. Lord, give me strength. Okay, so I think, one thing I often tell my colleagues who feel uncomfortable for whatever reason about the subjective effects of psilocybin and other psychedelics, and I think there's always this sort of emotional pushback. People don't feel comfortable occasioning an experience like this with a drug for whatever reason. I think that's another topic for another day. But I'll often say, look, let's not even think much about why it's working or what's happening, but let's just look at the outcomes. And if we can improve the effectiveness of our, for instance, smoking cessation interventions and save millions of lives, then let's not worry too much about the mechanism of action. That's one way of saying it, right? If you feel uncomfortable with it, don't worry about it. Just look at the outcomes. But the fact is, whatever's happening there is fascinating, And I think if we want to make the most out of these treatments, it really makes sense to understand exactly what's happening there. So let me just tell you really briefly, there's a lot here about what we're doing now. We're finishing up a pilot trial. It's a fairly large pilot trial and ambitious. I realize now, after the fact. Of course, I've asked myself why would I have taken on such an ambitious project, but I did. And this is a pilot trial of psilocybin facilitated treatment for cocaine dependence. We are recruiting 40 people, and we're very close to that mark. But recruiting this population, retaining them, can be really complicated and challenging. And COVID has presented some novel challenges as well. But I'll tell you a little bit about what we do. I mean, much of what we do is sort of based on the Hopkins model, and I count those at Hopkins among my closest colleagues. And of course, I keep shouting out to Mary, but much of what I learned about guiding, I learned from her and Bill Richards and Matt Johnson. So before we even begin treatment, we screen our participants to make sure they're healthy. And it's a pretty simple screen. I think at this point, we're mostly concerned about any serious underlying heart conditions. We know that psilocybin can increase your blood pressure and your heart rate acutely and transiently. And I would often say, though I'm not a physician, but still, if you're not healthy enough to engage in moderate exercise, and you're probably not healthy enough to be administered psilocybin, of course, our participants are using a major stimulant on a regular basis and surviving regularly. So they really should be healthy enough to be administered psilocybin one time, but we go out of our way to ensure that we're protecting our participants' safety. And if they pass this screen, if they don't have hypertension and everything seems well, then we begin this preparation process, which takes place over 4 weeks. There are 4 meetings of 2 hours each. And it's client-centered, which means we're focusing on establishing that rapport and alliance with our participants. Like, we note that their experience with psilocybin could be extraordinarily intense and overwhelming and unlike anything they've ever experienced. And they need to feel very, very comfortable with us. They have to feel like they can turn to us for support. They have to feel like we've got their best interests at heart. They have to be prepared to surrender to that experience. And our thought is that maximizing that alliance and rapport is what allows participants to surrender completely. And we have to keep in mind that we're doing this research in Alabama. The Tuskegee studies, the infamous Tuskegee studies, were conducted not far from here. Most or all of our participants are economically disadvantaged. More than 90% of our sample is African American. So many of our folks just have a long history of feeling powerless and marginalized. And it's really important that they feel a sense of agency when they're with us, and they know that they can trust us and that we're not exploiting them. And I think that takes that preparation, that a month of preparation that we devote to ensure that everyone is ready for this experience. And I have to say, I am so really just amazed at the courage of our participants who are willing to engage in this clinical trial, which for many of them, they'll even say at the outset, sounds crazy, but they're willing to try anything at this point. We do scan our participants. We put them in an MRI before we administer the drug, a day or so before, and then a day or so after. But I'm not going to present these findings now. But I mean, I can tell you, having begun to clean these data, look over these data, cocaine would not appear to be good for your brain at all. And so I would strongly caution against it. It certainly leads to some degradation in your brain matter, and you really don't want that. And I think, if anything, that makes me feel another sort of sense of empathy for this population, because cognitive behavioral control is a real challenge. Showing up to appointments regularly can be very, very hard. And their chronic use of cocaine has a large part to do with that. Okay, so we administer our drug in a clinical research unit. So we don't have a dedicated room for psilocybin administration. It's in an outpatient research ward. So we have to sort of decorate the room before every session and then sort of take it down after each one. So that's required us to be somewhat entrepreneurial. I've got a Persian rug that was once my father's and then my sister's, and now it's mine. And I lay that down on the floor before every session. I have some artwork that I put on the walls. I use a Tibetan salt rock lamp to provide a nice amber glow, and that seems to work well. I don't think it's purifying the air, for the record, but it seems to work a lot better than a fluorescent light bulb. And of course, we use the same playlist that the folks at Hopkins have used now for years. So our participants lie in a bed they listen to this music and they wear headphones for the duration of this, 4 to 6 hour experience. They either get 25 milligrams per 70 kilograms of psilocybin or diphenhydramine 100 milligrams as a control. So they're getting a pretty big dose of psilocybin here, one that would definitely require that they be lying down and in a safe and comfortable environment. We usually the day after or 2 days after the drug administration, we meet to do the integration, make sure everything is well, begin to try to make sense of the experience and translate it into concrete behavior change. And then we have 4 more follow-up sessions with our participants before we end the treatment, send them on their way. And then there are assessments only that take place 3 and 6 months after treatment ends. So if psilocybin works, we're really subjecting it to a pretty rigorous evaluation here, because for many people, 6 months after treatment ends, there's going to be a regression to their prior behavior. Most people would have relapsed and returned to their prior patterns of use. And so let me show you some of our results from the first 10 participants that I was asked to unblind by my data safety and monitoring board. So they completed their participation. We collected all the data. We didn't have any more formal contact with them. Of course, many of our participants will reach out to us on their own to check in, because they've had a very meaningful experience with us and they wouldn't just say goodbye and never talk to us again. But this is after everything's been concluded, and we asked the pharmacy to reveal the randomization condition of the first 10 people. And the reason for that is my data safety and monitoring board had heard a bit about psilocybin at the time of our first meeting and thought, well, wait a second, maybe we should consider a crossover option for these participants instead of employing a simple between groups design, which is what we're doing now. And they wanted to see the data, and here they are. So, we ask our participants, how personally meaningful was the experience? And you can see in those in the psilocybin condition, now there are 6 of them. 2 said it was the single most meaningful, and the remainder said it was in the top 5. One of our participants in the placebo condition said it was the most meaningful experience of his life. And I think it's important to point out that there's a reason we have placebo conditions, but also for the people in this study, life has not been easy at all. It's been very hard. It's chaotic. I think this particular participant had spent more than a decade in prison. Upon release, he was known in Birmingham as an OG, an original gangster. He was somebody who had sold drugs, who had been engaged in some gun battles. People knew who he was. He was a marked man, not only by other people who were sort of trafficking drugs, but also by the police. So he didn't really have a day where he was resting easy. So to come into our study and to lie down in this bed, to listen to this music with 2 people he trusted, I think was very meaningful to him. And, I think that highlights also the sort of extra pharmacological factors that are involved in this work. And I often tell people, again, Mary, I'm glad you're here, because when I went up to Hopkins very early years ago, when I was being trained in this, Mary asked me if there was any piece of music that was meaningful to me. And I said, well, my father played the clarinet, and my father passed away 20 years ago, but he played so often that hearing the clarinet was like, to me, hearing his voice. So she said, well, lie down on the couch, and she put the eye shades on me and the headphones, and she played Mozart's clarinet concerto. And in that moment, I have to say, I felt emotional. I felt almost a little tearful, and it kind of surprised me. And I think there's something about being in an environment where you feel very cared for and comfortable, and you're listening to music that can be very powerful, that you could say even without the psilocybin, it's a powerful experience. All right, moving on. We also asked people how spiritually significant, and you can see that half of those first 6 people said it was number 1, with another person saying it was in the top 5. And, this is interesting because we're in the Deep South. It tends to be a little more religious. This is a part of the country that is very explicitly Christian, and I can tell that even some participants would say to me, well, I'm not sure I should have had a spiritual experience with the drug in a hospital, so I'm not sure how to answer that question. So it might be that more people would endorse this item if they felt like it was okay to do so. And I can see with some people, there's this sense that I probably shouldn't say it was spiritual because I was in a hospital. I should have been in a church, but it was clearly spiritual for many people. So here are our initial findings. Again, I know I'm going through this quickly and there's a lot to take in, but follow me as best you can. So our primary outcome is the percentage of days that participants report being abstinent from cocaine. We collect a urine drug screen every time we see them. So there is some biochemical verification of that, though, after about a week or so, the cocaine would leave the system, and we're, relying on self-report, but that would be the case for both conditions. So it wouldn't be a confound. So we want to see this increase. And in the red, we see those who received psilocybin, and in the black, those who got the placebo. So at baseline, you can see that on average, they're using about half the time, which is quite a bit, mind you, right? So unlike with alcohol and tobacco, which can be obtained fairly easily, they're legal, they're tolerated. Cocaine is harder to get. You have to rely on an illicit black market, and sometimes people are limited to how much money they have. So they'll spend as much as they're able to, and if they could use every day, they might, but they may not have the money to do so. And we can see, so this is from the period of time that they've contacted us, but they haven't yet received any treatment, that the percentage of abstinent days begin to increase. And this is very common in clinical trials. People will begin to change before you've provided any kind of treatment, because, let's be honest, these are the people who are very motivated, who've sought out the treatment, who've jumped through the hoops. They really want to make a change in their lives. So they're going to start changing before we even really ask them to. At the third period of time, this is, again, from the time that they begin to receive behavioral intervention, we can see, again, an increase in the percentage of days that are abstinent, but no differences between the conditions. Where we do see a difference is from the period of time after we've administered the drug, that's DA, drug administration, to end of treatment, EOT. And here we see that in this small sample, you'll notice there's no error bar around the psilocybin condition, and that's because all of those first 6 participants reported 100% abstinence. Whereas there was a fair amount of abstinence among those who received the placebo, but not quite as much as there was among those who received the psilocybin, and already this difference is statistically significant. That's what the p-value indicates here. If it's less than 0.05, it's statistically significant. This D is a Cohen's D. This tells us how large the effect is. And a Cohen's D of 0.8 is considered large. So this is a very large effect, but should be taken with a grain of salt since the N is only 10. We also see a nearly significant difference at the period of time from end of treatment to 90-day follow-up. There's a what you might say a slight return, a slight lapse among those who got the psilocybin. But this then returns to, again, 100% abstinence reported from the period of time from 90 days after the end of treatment to 180 days after the end of treatment. And that difference is statistically significant and very large. I don't know if these trends will continue, as we complete data collection. I wouldn't look too much into it, but still, I think it's worth noting that the trends are in the hypothesized direction for now, and that's encouraging. Some people have said, "Hey, it looks like those who receive placebo are also doing pretty well," and I would say, "Yeah." And again, these are people who were very highly motivated, who saw our ad, who jumped through the many hoops that were required, who received 8 sessions of CBT from us, and I would expect them to be doing quite well. And there's always an issue with clinical trials, in that you're reaching the most motivated people. And of course, these results wouldn't generalize to the entire population of cocaine users. I think we could say they generalize to the population of cocaine users who are very highly motivated to stop and who can engage in a pretty intensive treatment paradigm. But the only purpose really I see in conducting a trial like this is to indicate that the experimental intervention, whatever it might be effective in treating the condition. How that might actually work in the real world is a different matter altogether. And any of you who might be clinicians would know that typically in an efficacy trial, the sort of the effectiveness that we see there is usually much less in the real world. And I think that's why it's probably important to say, look, we're all really excited about classic psychedelics and what they might do, but they're not going to work for everybody, because there's very little that works for everybody. And a big question for us going forward is determining, why do some people respond really well, and why might some people not respond very well? And can we tweak these interventions so that we get the most out of them? And I think, again, that's why it's so important to understand what might be going on here. This is also, by the way, a measure of the severity of dependence. This is the severity of dependence scale, and this captures the degree to which participants sort of report that the drug use is interfering with their lives. And it's just a series of items based on the DSM-4. And we can see here that the two groups are pretty much the same at the first MRI. And I realize I haven't made this very easy for you to understand since I'm using different labels, but I think when we have all the data together, hopefully it'll be more clear. But at the first MRI, we haven't given anybody any drug yet. So the two conditions, the two participants in the two conditions would say that the severity dependence is decreasing, and that's good. But we don't see any differences between the conditions until after we've given them their medication. And there we can see that those who get the placebo generally report a decrease in the severity of their dependence, but this rebounds when the treatment is ended, and that's what we would expect. When we withdraw treatment, the issues typically rebound. But those who receive psilocybin report a sort of steady decrease in dependence until the final follow-up, where they're telling us it's not an issue for me anymore at all. And that's really wonderful. And again, we'll have to see what happens with the larger sample. Again, I don't think this will work for everyone, but this is still a very promising signal. So the question is, what the heck is going on? And I thought about this. I'm a psychologist by training. So some of you might be interested in inflammation and a reduction in inflammation or changes to the default mode network. And I think that's really interesting. But since I'm a psychologist, I'm ultimately wanting to know, what is the psychological level of explanation? So these are not competing explanations. They're just different levels of them. So whatever's happening at the psychological level is going to have a neurobiological correlate. And people like my friend Chuck Nichols in Louisiana could say something about the neurobiological process, or Fred Barrett at Hopkins could tell you a lot about what's happening in the brain. But I'm a psychologist. I don't do imaging. I'm not really one who looks at markers of inflammation, though I think that's fascinating. I'm really interested in that psychological level of explanation. I think this is really important in part because I think for participants, what is ultimately going to resonate with them is that psychological level of explanation. So it's one thing to say, well, we've normalized your default mode network. Okay, that seems kind of mysterious and outside of our grasp. It's also another thing to say we've reduced inflammation in your central nervous system. But it's another to explain to them this experience in words or terms that they can understand and that makes sense to them intuitively. And that's, again, where I think the psychological level of explanation can be helpful. So anybody know who this is? Maybe. So this is Carl Jung. He's a extremely prominent figure in psychodynamic psychotherapy. And I was not trained as a psychodynamic psychotherapist. I am a behaviorist. And I guess most behaviorists are supposed to reject psychodynamic theories ardently. And I don't necessarily do that myself, but these theories sort of fell out of favor in part because they're very difficult, if not impossible, to test. And a theory isn't especially scientific if you can't test it. But still, when asked what might be happening with psychedelics early on, many psychotherapists who are psychodynamic in nature would say, well, you are accessing unconscious conflicts, you're resolving them in some way. And if you look at the earlier literature, including from people like Stan Grof, a luminary in the field, it's very heavily influenced by psychodynamic theory. And there might be something to some of these explanations, but as a behaviorist, I didn't find it very helpful nor testable to say, well, resolving some sort of unconscious conflict, and that's why psychedelics seem to be so powerful. So I moved on from Jung's explanation, and somebody asked the famous behaviorist B.F. Skinner, something of an academic hero of mine, what's going on with drugs? And he said, well, they're proxies for environments. So what does that mean? In any given environment, some behaviors are going to be reinforced and rewarded. And the sort of behaviors that are reinforced or rewarded are going to vary by environment to environment. So I'm rewarded for dressing in a more formal way when I go to work and to carry myself in a very professional manner there. But if I did that here around my children, they want to know what's wrong with me. And so there's just one example of how environments can reward different behaviors. And B.F. Skinner thought, well, maybe drugs are just sort of proxies for environment. Somehow you're creating a different sort of environment, and now different behaviors take on different reinforcement value. That's about all he had to say about it. And again, from my perspective, it didn't really resonate too much, and I felt a little unsatisfied and felt like the explanatory value of that notion was limited. So that led me to our man here that many of you probably know because of his ties to Boston, Timothy Leary, who was much maligned, I think, unfortunately, because he was a very brilliant person. and extraordinarily charismatic. And, you know, I would be lucky, I think any of us would be lucky to have just a fraction of his intelligence and charisma. But I guess he didn't do a whole lot of science when he discovered psychedelics as he did something else. I've heard some people refer to him as a benign cult leader. I don't know, that seems a little harsh, but I'm not exactly sure what he was doing, but he actually had some pretty brilliant ideas in this book he wrote with Ralph Metzner and Ram Dass or Richard Alpert, The Psychedelic Experience. And here he likened it to a religious conversion. He stopped there, but that's where I felt like, okay, that's now where we're getting to something. It's a religious conversion of sorts. Of course, the next question is, well, what in the world is going on with religious conversions? What is that all about? And that brought me to what we'll talk about now. And a lot of it has to do with this emotion, awe, AWE. And we'll say a little bit about that. And I think we have to first start with evolution. And we know that there are some fundamental principles of evolution. We're all familiar from our high school biology courses, perhaps, that mutation and natural selection are two fundamental principles. But most evolutionary scientists now say that natural cooperation is a fundamental principle of evolution. That cooperation is sort of key to survival. And if you just think about what's happening in your body at this very moment, all manner of different systems are cooperating with one another to allow you to breathe and live and experience this world. But even, you know, at the species level, we see that cooperation is sort of king in the natural world. So some of the most successful species are highly social and they work together. Elephants, wolves, dogs, marine mammals, like these killer whales, horses, and penguins, and sea otters, so cute, right? You know, the whole idea, non-human primates, the whole idea here is it's not that you want to be the biggest, baddest thing on the block. You know, if that were helpful, then we'd still have megalodon sharks in our waters. But just being the biggest thing that eats everything in your sight doesn't really help long-term survival. What really matters is one's ability to cooperate with others. And we see a lot of this across the animal kingdom. And, you know, humans are no example. I'm sorry, are no exception, I should say. You might say, well, no, we're a bad example, but you know, we do cooperate quite a bit. You know, where we've gotten into trouble is we can cooperate very well with members of our tribe, with members of our in-group. We don't always cooperate with those who are not members of our tribe. And that has led to a lot of, you know, death and suffering. But many people argue, like Steven Pinker, that we're getting much better at this, that we're becoming more peaceful, more cooperative. And you think about it, humans, we are pretty weak. We can't tolerate much of a temperature change relative to most of the animal kingdom, right? We don't have the sort of physical attributes that will allow us to thrive in the wild. But what we can do is we can cooperate with each other. We also have pretty incredible brains that allow us to solve some incredible problems. But cooperating is in large part what's allowed us to establish civilization and to do what we're doing to this day. So cooperation is really key. So I want to now bring this presentation to a little exercise here. Take a look at these images, really immerse yourself in them. This is Sainte-Chapelle at Paris. Really immerse yourself in these images. And take a few moments and just think about what you're feeling as you look at these images. And I'll be quiet for a moment as you do. Okay, here's another. So looking at the disk of the Milky Way, how do you feel as you look at this? Another picture taken in Muir Woods at the Redwood Forest there. How do you feel when you really immerse yourself in these images? A picture taken at one of my favorite places, the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Here we are looking out at the vast ocean. Maybe you find yourself feeling like this. Oh, that was designed to make you laugh, by the way. It makes me laugh. So I want to give you some anecdotes here, some personal reports from people who've had some unique experiences, what you might call mystical experiences. And I want you to try to guess whether these had anything to do with psychedelics or if they were just organic. And if we were, here live, I'd take I'd have people raise their hands and sort of take a roll call here, but we'll just have to do this on our own. So here's my first one. Out of the absolute blue, suddenly, oops, I skipped ahead. Pretending like you didn't see that. Suddenly, everything went gold and the crucifix started shimmering and the room was shimmering. And I had this unbelievable experience of God loving me. That is the experience of Marsha Linehan, who was the creator of dialectical behavior therapy, a very prolific scientist, one of the more influential clinical psychologists of our day. And she described what was an organic mystical experience she had as a young woman. And before she became a scientist, she was going to enter a convent. She was planning to become a nun. And she now is very open that she likely had what we now call borderline personality disorder. And one day she was just feeling, a sense of despair and had this incredible experience in a small chapel there in this convent. And it, transformed her, she said. So there were no psychedelic drugs involved as far as we know in that experience. But one point I'm trying to make here is that it can be really difficult to determine whether or not that's the case. Here's another. Then I had a vision of absolute divine love. It was like a flowing spring of silvery white liquid, overflowing upward, and was very beautiful to watch and feel. The feeling was of love and compassion toward the divine and toward all men. Again, you might wonder, well, was that a psychedelic experience or was it organic? That was the very important pioneer and Boston-based Walter Pankey. And that was the experience that he reported after Bill Richards gave him LSD. And according to Bill, Walter finished until he had completed some of the research projects he was working on there in Boston, including the Marsh Chapel experiment, before he had his experience with LSD, or something along these lines. And in any event, again, you can see that these experiences, whether they're organic without a psychedelic or psychedelic induced, are hard to tell apart. Here's another. Heaven was opened and a fiery light of exceeding brilliance came and permeated my whole brain and inflamed my whole heart and my whole breast like a warming flame, as the sun warms anything its rays touch. You might be wondering, who is that? What is that? Hildegard of Bingen, a Christian mystic, a scholar of the church, a musician, brilliant woman. And that was a mystical experience that she had that really transformed her life. Some of you might recognize this, but this really amazed me when I read it. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or parcel of God. I am the lover of uncontained and immortal beauty. I mean, to me, that sounds like a large dose of LSD. But no, it's just Ralph Waldo Emerson from Nature describing how he feels when he spends time in nature. Here's another. I went right into nature, speaking of. I became nature and life, and I lived as one and moved as one with life. I became all things of life, beings falling into my own body as a one-cell creature and big, beautiful colors. I was the universe, the big, beautiful universe. And the universe spoke to nature and nature spoke to me saying, I am God, you are God, all is God. That was a fellow named Wally from a research study conducted in Baltimore by Savage and McCabe in the 70s. And this was a study of LSD in the treatment of heroin addiction. Results were very impressive. That was published in Archives of General Psychiatry, now JAMA Psychiatry. That is probably one of the more highly cited papers now in this sort of renaissance of psychedelic work and substance use disorders. This is the last one. This is someone talking about the sort of after effects of this experience. You see how diminutive your life and concerns are compared to other things in the universe. Your life and concerns are important to you, of course, but you can see that a lot of the things you worry about do not make much difference in an overall sense. The result is that you enjoy the life that is before you. It allows you to have inner peace. Again, that sounds to me like one of my participants who's had a psilocybin experience, and no one would ever really be able to guess this, but this was Edward Gibson, an astronaut, NASA astronaut, explaining what it's like to stand on the moon and look back on the planet Earth. So what am I getting at? Again, I think this is all about awe. And as I showed you those pictures, hopefully you felt some sense of, feeling very small, a sense of amazement or wonder. Wow. Maybe a sense of serenity, maybe a sense that, time was standing still to some degree, and you weren't really thinking about much of anything other than the image you saw. You were immersed in it, and all your concerns for a period of time didn't exist, perhaps. Awe is an emotion that we experience when we're in the presence of a stimulus that is so vast and outside of our understanding that we have to change the way we view reality. We call this a need for accommodation. We have to change the way we view reality. So obviously, if you're looking back at the planet Earth for the first time in your life, you can imagine thinking, well, not only is the universe so vast, not only is the planet so vast, but this is such a novel experience. I have to change the way I view things. And for many astronauts or many other who report on this, they often have this insight that, wow, we inhabit this little planet in this massive universe. And isn't it funny that we find a way to squabble and fight with one another when we're all just sharing this little blue dot together? It promotes what's called the small self. This is this construct. The small self is a sort of state where you have a reduction in self-directed thoughts and behaviors, where you're just not thinking much of yourself. Your attention is so acutely drawn outside of yourself. It's so acutely directed toward this stimulus outside of where you are that you can feel very, very small. You might even feel like you don't exist because you're not thinking about yourself. You're thinking about the stimulus. And for many people, this is experienced as sublime, like one of the most incredible emotions you can experience. It can also be a little frightening. It's on the boundaries of fear. But why is it such a powerful experience, we might ask? And I would say it's because it is the emotion that encourages a behavior that is prized by evolution, and that's cooperation. Right? So why would this emotion facilitate cooperation? Well, I think it's pretty simple. To cooperate with others, we have to, in some way, be willing to, you might say, subjugate our own needs for the need of the group. We might say, look, I'm not going to do what's best for me, but what's best for us. And doing what's best for us often requires that we think less of ourselves. So I think about C.S. Lewis, who has this great quotation on humility. And he says, and this is paraphrased, but humility is not thinking less of ourselves, but thinking about ourselves less. So I think what we have here is the experience of awe with psychedelics. People are in the presence of an incredibly vast stimulus that's so novel and so outside their understanding, they forget who they are, where they are. Not only that, but their attentional scope is widened. And suddenly they're thinking of new connections. They have insights. They have a degree of introspection. You think again about this idea of cooperation. There are superorganisms like ants, where no one individual is thinking about itself. Each individual is acting for the good of the larger organism. And some of these superorganisms are extraordinarily successful from an evolutionary perspective. I read once somewhere on the BBC that some scientists had estimated that if you weighed all the ants on the planet, they would outweigh all the humans, which I found hard to believe, though these scientists later said, well, okay, maybe not quite, but there are a whole lot of ants. They're doing really well. So are termites and other organisms like this. I think also about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs here. And initially he put self-actualization at the top of this hierarchy, but he changed that later and said, no, like ultimately what we're all working toward is something transcendent, something bigger than who we are, right? So you've met your basic safety needs, you've met your basic social needs, you've self-actualized, there's something done well, and now it's maybe devoting yourselves to something bigger than who you are. So this idea that of all the behaviors, cooperation is prized most by evolution, and that of all the emotions, awe seems to be the most sublime because it tracks to this most prized behavior. This of course comports well because Abraham Maslow would also say, of all the experiences that we could have as humans, self-transcendence, right? Committing to something bigger than selves, to the self, or transcending the self is at the top of this hierarchy. And I think, again, the experience that people have with psychedelics is often one of self-transcendence and awe. And if you look across world religions, we can see that this is the case. This is a painting by Salvador Dali, one of my favorite paintings, really beautiful. But you think from the Christian tradition, we have that no one can have greater love than to lay down his life for his friends. And my apologies that some of these quotations are not inclusive. I wish they were more inclusive of gender. Perhaps I'll edit that in the future. These are direct quotations. But the whole idea being here that we often recognize that one of the most important things humans often do is sacrifice their own needs for the good of the group. And you think about who we really value and admire for good reason. It's often those who, in some cases, sacrifice their lives for the people they love, for their country or whatever it might be. So you might think about first responders and our members of the military and others. There's also this really fascinating concept from Tibetan Buddhism. A friend of mine who's a Tibetan Buddhist introduced me to. This is bodhicitta, the desire to attain enlightenment, motivated by great compassion for all sentient beings, accompanied by a falling away of the attachment to the illusion of an existing self. So the whole idea is that the less you're sort of thinking about yourself, the less yourself is there, the more you might feel connected to others. Again, these are concepts that world religions emphasize also. And I think that's relevant, that's notable. I think then often these awe experiences can lead to a quantum change. And when you think, again, awe is about, it's not just about being in the presence of something really big, because you could look up at the sky and say the sky is huge, but you see it all the time, so you don't have to change the way you view reality. And it's not just in the presence of being something that's novel, because you might encounter novel things all the time, but if they're not sort of big and overwhelming, they don't quite have the same effect. And the idea is you're in the presence of something so massive and so novel that, again, it challenges the way you view the world, or the universe, I should say. And I often think of this great short story by Isaac Asimov called Nightfall. I don't know if anyone's read it, but the basic idea is there's some planet, some fictional planet elsewhere, and it orbits a handful of suns, 3 or 4, however many suns. And for whatever reason, the people who live on this planet never experience nighttime because they're always facing one of these suns. But every so often, every 1,000 or 2,000 years, things work out just right that they experience nighttime. And the inhabitants of this planet are under the assumption that, well, this universe, it consists of us and these suns, and that's about it. And then for the first time in a few thousand years, they all face the night sky and realize the universe is far more massive than we understood. Everything about the nature of reality has to be changed. Now, Isaac Asimov was a little dark, and in this little short story, many people couldn't quite change the way they viewed reality, and attempted to burn everything they could find to sort of light out the night sky. But this is still an example of where you might experience, okay, this sort of vastness and novelty where you have to change the way you view reality. And there is this notion of quantum change in psychology, and it comes from critical fluctuations in dynamical systems theory. It's from electrical engineering. Like, okay, it sounds a little complicated, but just read this passage. When challenges to the current steady state of a system are too great to assimilate, change is often not gradual and linear, but characterized by sudden disturbance and increased variability in system behavior before reorganization. I think that's just another fancy way of saying, look, when we're in the presence of something that's huge and outside of our understanding, we're not going to change just a little bit. We're just going to kind of change everything. We're going to change the way we see everything, and we're probably going to change our behavior. And I think, you know, humans have probably realized that this sort of thing happens, and it happens frequently. And the fictional account of Ebenezer Scrooge is a great example. Somebody who might have been very focused on himself and acquiring material wealth has this experience that's so different and really causes him to think outside of himself. And he realizes, well, I've been this greedy miser and I've impacted people around me in a negative way. I'm finally thinking outside myself and I really want to change. And he changes suddenly, dramatically, and we assume for good. So let's see, maybe just a few things here. So I think it makes sense that this countercultural revolution of the 60s was sort of fueled by LSD, you know, this idea that you might have an experience where you feel a connection with others, in part because you are thinking outside of yourself. And you know, it's interesting because to this day, there are whispers of this notion that psychedelics could change the way we operate on a global scale and, you know, usher in global peace. And I mean, that would be lovely if that were possible. I think the challenge there is that we don't know when we might identify only with our tribe or in-group and when we'll identify with all humanity. And it's kind of alarming. I've heard that there are some neo-Nazi groups, according to some news coverage, that are very fond of psychedelics. So I think, you know, we should probably not get too far ahead of ourselves and realize that, you know, it may not be that for everybody there's an experience of all humanity or all creation being one, but that could be limited to one's in-group. And, you know, we see that, for instance, in the case of religion, where for some people there is this connection with all humanity and the desire to do good. And maybe for others only a sort of identification with their in-group, and where we've seen, for instance, in the Middle East, suicide bombings. And certainly those who do this sort of behavior feel that they're sacrificing themselves for something bigger than who they are. So I don't think they're under the impression they're doing anything bad. And I think a big question is, well, when does this lead to really identification with all humanity and not just one's in-group? And that's a big question, I think, going forward. A few other things. Yeah, this is an actual quotation from the Mr. Beatle himself, Paul McCartney. And there's this one part of it that I thought was really interesting. He said, it would mean a whole new world if the politicians would take LSD. There wouldn't be any more war or poverty or famine. And I don't have any doubt that that was sort of his experience. But again, you know, I think individuals are going to vary. And I think there was this thought initially that psychedelic use could really alter your political orientation and sort of your entire outlook on the world. But I think that the data now would indicate that it probably doesn't. And if anything, just makes us you know, a truer version of ourselves. So it sort of amplifies who we already are. And for most of us, that's a really good thing. But I'm not quite sure that we can foster world peace with psychedelics alone. As I mentioned, the world is becoming a more peaceful and cooperative place. And here are just some reading recommendations if you're interested, including the previous is a book by Steven Pinker, and then this really good book by Joshua Goldstein. You know, I'm often asked, well, why in the world is it that mushrooms can, or psilocybin, which we find in the psilocybe genus, can create this sort of experience? And I say, man, isn't it weird? As far as we know, psilocybin appears to function as a pesticide. So an insect would come along to eat one of these mushrooms, and the psilocybin would disorient them, and they'd sort of wander off and stop eating the mushroom. It just so happens that psilocybin can create these sort of transcendent mystical experience in humans. And I think if we look at a lot of addictive substances, that they're often in plants that use these substances as a pesticide of some sort. So the tobacco plant seems to use nicotine as a pesticide, and the coca plant uses cocaine as a pesticide, or at least prevent insects from consuming it. I think it's a fascinating thing that it happened to have worked out this way. But my friend Dennis McKenna has bigger ideas. Maybe this has something to do with nature attempting to communicate with us in some way and encouraging cooperation. I don't know, that's outside my pay grade, but I still think it's a fascinating thing to realize there's this substance that grows widely in nature and that will bring about these experiences. And isn't that amazing? And what in the world is going on there? And I wish I had a good answer for you. I think a philosopher could tell us, but just note that the same nature that gives us psilocybin also gives us nicotine and cocaine and essentially heroin or opiates. So not everything in nature is good. Sometimes things are happenstance. Oh, that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to use the next few minutes for any questions that anybody might have, because I've been talking for a long time and surely somebody else other than me would like to talk.
Thank you, Peter. That was great. I'm in awe of how you've been juggling so much and giving us such a thought-provoking, beautiful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also loved you ending on Dennis. Our next speaker in January is Dennis McKenna.
Oh, you're lucky. That's
Yeah.
great.
So maybe you can come and ask him that question.
I have before. I would love to be there to ask him again.
Yeah. So first, just thank you for addressing the awe issue and reading your bio. That was what I wanted to hear about. So I assume other people did too. And it was really beautiful way to help us think about these medicines and how they work. We have a few questions, and if anyone, we don't have a lot of time, but if other people have questions they want to put in the chat, please feel free to do so. One of the comments, and I agree with this, is that being struck by the amazing diversity you've had in your studies. I know as a MAPS therapist working with MAPS that's one of our big goals that we've really failed badly at. And so kudos to you. I think it would be interesting to hear how you've been able to attract such a diverse population. And along with that question, I'm going to kind of lump questions together because we don't have a lot of time. How you found your participants, and how long was the chronic use in your typical patient, and what were the criteria regards prior use of psychedelics?
To answer the first question, I've worked with vulnerable populations for a very long time. When I graduated from college at the University of Virginia back in '98, I worked at a homeless shelter. I moved to San Francisco and I worked at a homeless shelter for a year. And there I did a little bit of everything, but I did a lot of work with women who were immigrants, some who were documented, some weren't. I did some translating, which was very challenging for the first 2 months because I'd only taken my required Spanish courses in college, but did some work there. I did some work with at an American Indian Healing Center. After that year, because I noticed addiction was a common thread linking those people who were experiencing homelessness, I wanted to study addiction further with the idea, I was 22 at the time, that I might be able to contribute in some way to improving the nature of our treatments or be a therapist one day and work with people who were dealing with addiction. And I went to Florida where I worked with, I studied smoking cessation primarily. And what's tragic about the nature of substance use disorders, and smoking is no exception, is that it is these mental health conditions are increasingly concentrated in individuals with less income and less education. So if you work in the addiction field, you're working with vulnerable people. I mean, obviously no one is immune to addiction, no demographic is immune, but again, it's increasingly concentrated in people with economic disadvantage and not much education, limited resources, people with mental health conditions. So I spent some time doing that before returning to San Francisco and sort of broadening my work to focus again on addiction, broadly speaking. And again, if you work in addiction or substance use disorders, you're going to be working with vulnerable folks. I arrived in Alabama in 2010, and this is with 11, 12 years of experience under my belt working with vulnerable folks, and started working with individuals in the criminal justice system. And I'm always learning and growing. I'm not going to say that I'm an expert in this area. And I would say that if you're going to work with vulnerable folks, you have to approach it with some cultural humility, which requires that you recognize that we're always learning, we're always growing, we always have to push ourselves to, to learn and grow and challenge ourselves. But I think if there's one thing that's helped, it's just to realize that many of the folks we see have an experience of powerlessness and marginalization, and they can't have that experience in a research study. They have to be seen as equal partners in this enterprise. They have to be given a sense of agency. And it's not enough to communicate empathy or to show that you're empathic, but you really have to feel it. And if it's sincere, if it's authentic, and you really care, I think that you can eventually sort of earn the trust of your participants and your community partners, and you can successfully recruit from this population. Even if you're like myself, where you're in a city that is over 72% African American, and you're a white guy from an affluent DC suburb, I think if you really try to be authentically empathic and show that you really do care and you're not just exploiting research participants for your own gain, then you can be successful. So I think that's what's led to some of our success there. I would just like to say, like, I think I really sincerely care. But again, I think I always need to check myself and question what I'm doing, why I'm doing what I'm doing, and try to get better. The next question is like, what's the average, how many years of use? That's a good question. I haven't actually looked at that yet, but if I had to guess, it would be between 20 and 30 years. And there are periods of time that they're using and periods of time that they're not. Addiction is a chronic relapsing disorder. So it would not be uncommon for someone to say, hey, I started when I was 20, I'm 50 now. And, I've had a year here or there where I haven't been using, but then I've, relapsed and found myself using once again. So this is a tough population, and cocaine, like I said, really disrupts cognitive behavioral control. Interventions or trials that target cocaine use disorder are typically associated with the highest rates of dropout, between 50 and 60%. So it's a really hard target, but there's no FDA approved pharmacotherapy for cocaine dependent. So if we've got some signal here, we could have something that could finally help these folks who, I can tell you, would really like to stop. But the nature of addiction is you really want to stop doing this thing, but you feel compelled to do it. And maybe psilocybin can offer some remedy for some people.
Beautiful. Thank you. Do you have time for one more question, Peter?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. So can I call on you, G. Jones? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, thank you so much for that presentation. It's really great to meet you, Peter. My name is Grant Jones, and I'm a fourth year clinical psych PhD at Harvard right now. And I'm particularly jazzed to meet you because a lot of my research is inspired by your population-based approaches to studying psychedelics. So thank you for being,
nice. Cool.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for just being a pioneer in that methodology. I've been really heartened to hear about the diversity of your samples and also your approach to thinking about approaching vulnerable communities. And I was wondering if I could just like double click on one of your answers and just hear a bit more about kind of like what, if there are specifics about what it means for you to like operationalize your empathy within the research setting, and particularly, as you said, as somebody who's white working with majority Black populations, I'm wondering like, are there specifics that you all build into your research process to make sure that, maybe structures of oppression that kind of we all can fall prey to don't, sneak their way into your research methodologies? And if it seems like you're having success, so if the answer is like, I'm just like trying to, be the best me I can be, which is a great answer. But just wondering if there's specific. What was that?
Those are fantastic questions.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so if you look at some meta-analyses on therapists' own ratings of their own multicultural competence, it tends to be not correlated with their patients' ratings of that own construct. So I don't think we're very good at rating our own multicultural competence or cultural humility. So I'm aware of that, and I don't think I can ever carry myself with this idea that I've got it figured out. I should mention in this population, they're all economically disadvantaged. Many of them have unstable living situations. Maybe 20% or so are living with HIV. Maybe another 20% or so are LGBTQ identified. many, if not all, have some history of criminal justice involvement. So, I mean, there are multiple overlapping layers of inequality and disadvantage here. And, you know, the question is, I think always how, you know, how do we best address this, and how do we ensure that we as the people doing this research are not sort of falling prey to some of these longstanding systemic sort of oppressive structures, that'd be the best way of putting it. And I wish I had a really good answer. I mean, I try to, and we have a really impressive Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and I've tried to, you know, take every course that they offer, ask that my research staff take every course that's offered. I really put a strong emphasis on diversity with the research staff. I think it's really important, and I would say this to anybody planning to do this work, that you have people who come from a variety of different backgrounds, who have different lived experiences. You're going to make better decisions. You're going to have, you know, different perspectives. You're going to generate better ideas. You're going to, I think, treat your participants with more empathy and respect. So I think that's been an important part of the process. I mean, I try to, you know, stay abreast of the literature as best I can. And, you know, I think there's this sort of interesting juxtaposition where you need to be aware of these historical trends and how any number of these populations have been marginalized and oppressed over the years, but also note that any one individual that you see has a sort of unique universe of experience between his or behind his or her eyes, and obviously can't be reduced to a demographic characteristic. And sometimes an identity, what's most important to them, is not one that we think to check off when conducting our research. So many of my participants might tell me, you know, it's what's most important about me. How do I see myself above and beyond anything else? Often they tell me it's that I'm Christian. It's not that they're a man or a woman or black or white, or that they're homeless, or that they're poor, or that they're gay or living with HIV. It's that they're Christian. And I think that's really interesting. That's just one sort of example of how we need to make sure that we allow our participants to tell their story, because they tell their story better than anyone else. And so I'm probably not really answering your question. I don't really know what the best answer is, other than to try to take that first guiding principle of cultural humility to heart. And that is that we're constantly learning, we're constantly growing, there's no finish line. And we just have to be as aware as we possibly can. I mean, we're in Alabama. The Tuskegee studies were conducted only 40 minutes away. Sometimes when we have participants, I'll tell them, so here you are at this big research university, and you're sitting here in the same room with this white scientist. How do you feel about that? I mean, I think sometimes it can be helpful to just to call that out. And if people express hesitancy, you have to, of course, realize that it's completely justified, that should be responded with nothing but empathy. You know, some of the other things that you mentioned, I mean, you've got to be really flexible with your hours, right? So you work from 9 to 5, so do other people. Their lives are difficult. You've got to be flexible with regard to people canceling and rescheduling. You've got to be willing to meet on weekends. If people don't have access to transportation, I think you've got to be open to budgeting in your research trials for transportation so that they can make it to where you are. If you know there are concerns that the results of your study won't be held confidential and potentially reported to law enforcement, you've got to be extremely transparent in the consent process and throughout about what you're doing and why you're doing what you're doing. I think it's really important in these trials that there not be any deception whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I mean, hopefully I'm kind of hitting on the points that are meaningful to you. I mean,
Yeah.
Health literacy is a big thing too. Like, we're all very highly practiced in understanding written language and expressing ourselves with it, but many of these folks may not be at all. So like, what's the ethical way of talking about what we're doing and asking people about their experiences and engaging in the informed consent process? We have to be very careful with the language we use. And so I think in short, it just really helps to be really flexible, to allow for a lot of rescheduling, to be extremely transparent, to use appropriate language, and to be just, as empathic as possible, and sometimes just draw attention to this sort of historical marginalization and feelings of powerlessness that people have had, and just ensure that your research space is not one where they again feel powerless and marginalized.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for those answers. So many follow-ups that I want to ask. Obviously, we're over time, but I will be reaching out.
Please feel free to email me. Yeah, I would
I
love to
will
know
be,
more.
so imminently. So
Okay.
cool. Yeah.
Really beautiful, Peter. Thank you. Thank you. And we are mindful of your time. Want to get you to your soccer game. I just am so grateful that you were able to spend time with us. And I know I'm getting messages from many others saying that you're clearly a bright light in this field of psychedelic research. And we really look forward to seeing where you're going to go with it, to be with you at this point and see what's going to happen next. And this work with any sort of substance abuse is so important. So,
well, I can tell you this. I really love Isaac Newton's quotation, "If I've seen far, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants." There's so many people who've done so much. I'm doing just this one little thing. When I started this line of work, I thought, boy, if we could just get to the point where there's an FDA indication for cocaine, for psilocybin, where people might have access to psilocybin in clinics and hospitals, then I would have accomplished my goal. And now with this smoking study, I feel like, well, that's close. And part of me thinks, well, I guess I can just retire or something. Maybe I set the bar too low, but there are so many bright minds. Grant is one who have so many important research questions to be answered. And I'm kind of looking forward to stepping aside and letting the next generation of really enthusiastic scientists answer these questions, because there will be questions forever. I'm very happy just answering just one or two and then stepping aside.
great. Well, thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful. And hopefully we'll get you back with us at some point.
Yeah, I would love to do that.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Bye-bye.